So, hello everybody. I'm Ken Whitty, and I'm a member of the Fridays at 1 committee. I used to be chairman. I've passed on that baton to Leslie Herman and Ruth McAmon. Can you hear me? Is that better? I'll lean right into it. Okay, so that Fridays at 1, this is for our non-IRP members, are one of the few activities that the IRP, the Institute for Retired Professionals, that welcomes everyone to participate from the New School community and from everywhere in New York and its suburbs. And if you'd like to find out more about the IRP, you can Google us or go to newschool.edu/IRP. And the group has been a pioneer in peer-to-peer lifelong learning since it began in 1962. And this is our last Fridays at 1 for the semester. And unfortunately, because of scheduling problems and some of the uncertainties for next spring, we're not going to be able to have Fridays at 1 next spring, but we will be back soon after that, hopefully next fall. So, introduce our speaker for today. It's my pleasure to introduce Eugene Linden. Eugene has written for many years about global environmental issues as a senior writer for Time magazine, and later as a contributor to Time, Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, National Geographic, The Wall Street Journal, among many others. And he's the author of many books on science, technology, and the environment, and of special relevance to today's topic is his The Winds of Change, Climate, Weather, and the Destruction of Civilizations. Welcome, Eugene Linden.
Thank you, Steve. And by the way, Steve has elegantly arrayed some of my books. Ken, I keep calling you by your brother's name. I'm terribly sorry, Ken. Anyway, Ken has elegantly arrayed some of my books, and I hope anybody's interested might buy them so I don't have to lug them back to my car. It's a little bit intimidating to talk to a bunch of professionals since I'm basically an amateur. But I have been immersed in these issues for a long time. And let me see if I call up. And I've taken the title for today's talk from a couple of issues I've followed for a very long time, going back many decades. One is population, and the other is climate change. And then I cleverly linked them in this title, Two Crises Converging After 8,000 Years. I'm leaning over so I can talk into the mic so you can hear me in the back. If I stand up straighter, it'll look better for the YouTube, but you might not be able to hear me, so I'll lean over. I could have equally called this talk Two Crises Converging After 5 million years, but had we done this title, I doubt whether any of you would have shown up, and so I hope you'll forgive my bait and switch. The fact is that human fate has been twinned with climate change long before humans existed. So as I mentioned, these two issues have been twinned forever, but the difference is that we're now beginning to recognize that. Unfortunately, it's a bit too late. So let's start by looking at where we are right now, and then I'll go back, way back, and take a look at about how we got here, both in evolutionary terms and then in recent history. Where we are is that some of the long-predicted derivatives of global warming and the population explosion are unfolding right now, pretty much on schedule, and we're still dithering about what to do about it. For instance, one tributary to the much-discussed caravan is that Honduras and Guatemala have among the highest birth rates in the world. Thomas Homer Dixon did a study for the CIA that was never published some years back, showing that in countries where population grows faster than the economy can absorb the young men, unemployed and idle young men can gravitate to gangs and extremist groups, and these in turn can destabilize societies, leading to migration. He was actually writing about North Africa, but the same is true now for Honduras and Guatemala. And I think this accounts for a large component of the caravan as families find their only escape from the gangs in some of these Central American countries is to flee. It's also true in the case of some of the migrants moving to trying to get to Europe from Africa. And then there are climate refugees. Parts of Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, and some other Middle Eastern countries are now uninhabitable in the summer, as extraordinary summertime temperatures make outdoor work impossible and make growing crops impossible. Those fleeing those regions first go to the cities, and then some portion join the throngs trying to make it to Europe. And of course, a second derivative of this is that the overwhelming numbers of ethnically different migrants trying to get to Europe fuel nationalist movements in those countries trying to absorb the people. This in turn creates a link between changing climate and exploding populations and the rise of quasi-fascist movements around the world. And by the way, this is something that economists just don't get when they attempt and fail to model the economic costs of climate change. It's not just that the direct impacts that affect an economy, but the political repercussions of a changing climate as hundreds of millions of people react to local changes ranging from droughts to heat to sea level rise to rampant new epidemics cause derivative impacts that also negatively affect economic growth. And so I'm going to, as an aside, in the 1990s, William Nordhaus, who just got the Nobel Prize for trying to model the economic impacts of climate change, is really, I wrote an op-ed for the LA Times just recently, where taking him to task and taking them to task for basically illiteracy about the economic impacts of climate change, because he wrote in the early 90s that the total economic cost of climate change would be 0.5% in 2100 of GDP. We just had a recent study that was many times that estimate. And one of his arguments was that the IPCC, the great group of 2,000 scientists that put out these assessments of climate every few years, had written back then that thermal inertia of the oceans would mean that you didn't really have to do anything for many decades before these economic impacts, mild as they were, would come to fruit. Well, no politician is going to jump out of his chair and say we have to do something about climate change if the total impact is going to be 0.5% of GDP 120 years from then. And that led to a lesser sense of urgency about dealing with the problem. And it's one of the many reasons, I'll get to some others, that we're having face what we face today without any real action taken. Where we are today is that the Earth has warmed a little more than 1 degree since pre-industrial levels. That's centigrade. Doesn't sound like much, but the regional changes have been much more dramatic. And in the past, a 1 degree change in temperatures has just brought chaos to the world in pre-industrial times. 5 of the 10 most destructive wildfires in California's history took place in the last 18 months. Think about that. We're going back 100 years, 5 of the most destructive fires. Now, part of it is that California's gotten richer, people have moved into more fire-prone areas, but part of it is that in the Camp Fire, for instance, just in the days preceding that fire, the humidity was in single digits, record low humidity. And at that level, the air actually sucks moisture out of vegetation and creates tinder. 2014, 2015, 2016, each set records as the hottest year ever globally. 2017 ranked 3rd, 2018 ranked 4th. You see a pattern here? Hold on. Then there's, look at what's happened with hurricanes. We all witnessed the destruction of Hurricane Michael, which hit the Gulf Coast and destroyed a town. But what I thought was more ominous about the hurricane was that just a couple of days before it became a Category 5 monster, it was a Category 1, scarcely worth mentioning. And this has happened repeatedly with hurricanes. And not only are they becoming, in some respects, more destructive, but they are ramping up their intensity much more rapidly than in the past. And that's a new phenomenon. Now, before I drop back to discuss how we got here, I want to lodge a thought. Given that global warming is accelerating, does anyone think that we will see less of these destabilizing derivatives in the future if the globe warms by another degree to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which is now likely unavoidable? I'll leave that with you. So let's look at how we got here. We'll go back 2.5 million years in Africa at the onset of the most recent ice ages. That event launched a series of great swings in climate. They were cooling and drying that lasted 100,000 years or more, each of these swings. Richard Potts, who heads the Institute for the Study of Human Origins at the Smithsonian, used data collected by Peter Domenical, a paleogeochemist who is dean of the Lamont Doherty at Columbia. And he showed that during these periods of climate instability, the more specialized hominins, there were no humans back then, did poorly, while the more adaptable ones survived. To give you a couple of examples, Homo rudolfensis and Homo ergaster prospered, while Australopithecus boise did not. Another interesting correlation he discovered was that tool making became a permanent feature of Homo about 1.85 million years ago, further favoring those who could make tools during extreme times. And so one of the things is that climate change favored essentially the more brainy and adaptable of our species and disfavored the more specialized, right? So in a sense, bad climate was good in terms of making us a smarter species. The other interesting thing is that even as the more generalized humans were prospering during the climate upheavals, so too were the more generalized ancestors of elephant, zebra, baboon, hippo. And so in evolutionary terms, climate upheaval favored the more adaptable of not just our species, but other species as well. But if climate chaos helped produce modern humans, it's a warm, stable climate that turbocharged our numbers. According to UNESCO numbers, human population was about 5 million, total global population 10,000 years ago, after the last throes of the last ice age. 7 million people populated the Earth about 6,000 years ago, 21,000, 4,000 years ago, 210 million at the beginning of the Christian era. And of course, the numbers kept climbing. In geologic terms, the last 8,000 years have been the sweet spot, the most favorable for humans in particular of any period going back to before Homo sapiens emerged. So the relationship between human well-being and climate is strong, and it's underscored by the minor hiccups that have occurred during the Holocene. During the medieval warm period, which ran roughly from 900 AD to 1300 AD, the population of Europe quadrupled. In England alone, the population tripled in the 1200s. Lifespan increased as well. Then came the Little Ice Age, which, by the way, was a cooling period that was globally maybe a degree centigrade. In other words, roughly the amplitude of the degree we've warmed since pre-industrial times, but in the other direction. And Europe's numbers during the Little Ice Age, after quadrupling in the previous 400 years, stagnated for the next 400 years before they took off again in the 19th century. So to sum up, bad climate was good for building humans, but good climate was necessary once we were built. And since a warm, stable climate produced the population explosion, why wouldn't more warmth be even better? The simple answer is agriculture and water. Beyond a certain temperature, plants have a hard time retaining moisture. And by some estimates, a 2-degree warming, total 2-degree warming from pre-industrial eras could reduce grain yields by 70%. Another key word is stable. One of the most destructive aspects of the Little Ice Age was it wasn't consistently cold, but rather a whipsaw of temperature changes that fostered the proliferation of both plant and human diseases. Microbes adjust much more rapidly to changing climate than animals and humans. But the factor we're really dealing with today, in terms of human numbers at least, is that I guess we could describe it as too much of a good thing. One of the pioneers of an arcane field called artificial life is a systems theoretician named Christopher Langton who used to work at the Santa Fe Institute. He's since abandoned the work, but he focused on how simple organisms evolved into more complex systems. In his work, he discovered a seesaw between stability and instability as different organisms tried different strategies to gain whatever given system they live in. Eventually, one organism comes out on top and proliferates until it destabilizes the system and it crashes, leading to a new cycle. The lesson is that your best adaptive strategy may ultimately hustle you off the evolutionary stage. And that's why I say too much of a good thing. And that's something to keep in mind as we turn to the present. So let's agree, or I'll stipulate, that climate and population have been linked since the dawn of the species. But, and this is an important but, this wasn't really recognized until just recent decades. When Paul Ehrlich was writing The Population Bomb, the widely shared assumption was that climate was stable and that if it changed, it would take about 1,000 years. I can cite some figures. In the 1950s, it was assumed that it took 8,000 years to move between an ice age and another climate regime. In the 60s, it was about 1,000 years. But some pioneering scientists like Wally Broecker and others, Cesare Emiliano, they were finding records both in seabed sediments and in ice cores that showed rapid changes. These as signals of rapid change were dismissed at first because they were thought to be either regional or that it was the result of folding in the ice or disturbance of the seabed. And so nobody believed that climate could change that fast. 1988, of course, that was the famous year when Jim Hansen talked to the US Congress on a sweltering day after 1,000 heat records had been broken, and global warming. All of a sudden, people thought, well, maybe humans could cause climate change. Actually, the people have been, different scientists have been speculating on that going back decades, but it actually broke out into the public in '88. Let's fast forward 6 years to 1994. What happened then was that Richard Alley, Paul Majewski, Willie Dansgaard, running 2 different deep drilling projects in the very peak of Greenland, a place where it was less likely that the bottom ice would have been perturbed, all came up with ice cores that showed dramatic climate changes in as little as 5 years. 16 degrees centigrade, roughly 34 degrees Fahrenheit, rises and drops in temperatures in a blink of an eye. And they did this through an examination of proxies. And they both published papers in Science and in Nature, and a series of papers. And the impact on the scientific community was nothing less than seismic, because it began to dawn on scientists was not just that rapid climate change happened, but that's how climate changes. It doesn't change. It's not a dial where you turn it up slowly and it slowly changes. It's more like a switch. And in the periods when it is changing, it doesn't change linearly, but rather rapidly back and forth. It whipsaws as it tries to find a new state. There are many who believe, and climate scientists who believe, that that's where we are right now. That same year in Cairo, there was a major population summit. And I went there and I wrote about it for Time magazine. And it looked like the world was finally coming to grips with exploding human numbers as well as with climate change. And it looked like those who were projecting future population trends could no longer assume that climate would be stable, that rainfall patterns would be the same as they were in the past. And that bread baskets might go dry even as human numbers were increasing. One would have thought that this would have focused minds. So what happened next on these issues? We all know the answer. Next to nothing. In 1994, global population was about 5.5 billion people. Today, it's about 7.6 billion people. That increase of 2.2+ billion people is equivalent to global population in 1940. In other words, between when these issues really sort of began to emerge and surface dramatically in the public mind, and now, when population has increased by the entire population of the world in many of our, and some, not many of ours, but some of our lifetimes. And today, human numbers still increase by about 80 million a year. And while as a percentage of global population, abject poverty is decreased, in over 20 countries, the absolute numbers of impoverished is now greater than the entire population of those countries in 1970. So look at it, you can look at it statistically in a couple of different ways. But what we see today is that if you are earning $1 a day or less, or $2 a day or less, and you're in one of these countries, and you can no longer sustain a living, what do you do first? You try to find someplace where you can, usually in a neighboring country or within your country or moving to the cities, and then you try and get someplace where there might be some hope. And for many of these people coming from both the Mideast and the South Asia and Africa, that place is Europe. We have today, this is, what are we now, 24 years after 1994. More than half the public, and I would say more than half the US Congress and White House, still don't believe that climate change will affect them in their lives. It's as though, you know, somebody said, an asteroid is coming towards the Earth. It's a pretty slow asteroid, but it's going to hit us in 20 years. And our reaction is to say, well, I don't believe in asteroids. But let's look at how the scientific, in the meantime, while the public is kind of complacent, politicians are complacent, scientists are not complacent. Look at how the assessment of risk has changed. In almost every instance, and let me interrupt myself, I'm actually writing an op-ed for the Times about this right now. In almost every instance, the worst case scenarios of the 1990s are either the conventional scientific wisdom or in some cases, the best case scenario. The IPCC assessments are the consensus document of 2,000 scientists around the world. As a consensus document, they tend to be more conservative because, one, there's political impacts on the documents. Now, of course, nature couldn't give a damn about human consensus. And so what the documents are, they have tended to radically understate what the real threat was. I'll give you some examples, but the net effect of that, along with what I mentioned before about the studies of the economic consequences of climate change, is that in the 90s, there was less of a sense of urgency than an actual realistic assessment of the consequences, even then, would have created. And the other thing is, if you have a less of a sense of urgency or a consensus that underestimates the threat, if you're spending billions of dollars, you really want to know what the worst case scenario is. For instance, Hurricane Sandy. The New York subways hadn't flooded in 120 years. Hurricane Sandy actually overtopped them for the first time. And what that meant, it's like a threshold. For instance, had the storm surge been 6 inches less, the subways would not have flooded, and we wouldn't have had $5 billion in damage to the subways, which was what the ultimate price tag was. So it's important that these documents are used for planning, that they be realistic, and yet they weren't. For instance, as late as 2001, the IPCC's range for sea level rise by 2100 was 20 to 70 centimeters. Today, this is what, 17 years later, not very long, the range is 55 to 250 centimeters. There's a big difference between 70 and 250 centimeters, as you might imagine, and it involves dislocating literally hundreds of millions of people who would not be dislocated if it's 55 centimeters. In 2007, go back to IPCC assessments, the actual estimate for sea level rise was as low as 26. The best case was 26 or 27 centimeters. Why was that? Well, even as that was happening, they were not including estimates of the contribution from melting and from the Greenland and the Antarctic ice sheets and the export of ice into the oceans. Why weren't they doing that? Because they said there weren't empirical studies of it. But at that very point, the melting in Greenland and Antarctica was contributing 30% of sea level change, even as it was ignored by the IPCC. So this is the problem. We can go through other examples. In the first assessment, IPCC assessment, the thought was the ice sheets, which we now know are in a state of, the West Antarctic ice sheet is in a state of irreversible collapse. That doesn't mean tomorrow, but it means you can't reverse it, was presumed to be stable until 2100. It was presumed that the permafrost was going to be stable until 2100. And as many of you have sure have seen, there's dramatic melting of the permafrost, even now, leading to those vast craters in Siberia, which those mysterious craters that as these kind of methane bursts, permafrost lasts, and there's an explosive release of methane. So here we are. We've got 7.6 billion people living on an ice age, on a knife edge, dependent on 5 staple crops for half our nutrition, and most of those crops are grown and come from just a few bread baskets, and they are dependent on rainfall distribution continuing as it was. Do we think that's going to continue, as I asked earlier? I haven't even talked about consumption, and which, of course, amplifies the impact of human numbers. But what we've seen, is that China, which was vastly less as a releaser of greenhouse gases in 1994, is now the largest emitter of greenhouse gases today. The U.S. is now second. It was first for many years. At the same time, rising incomes in China and India have had a dramatic impact on the world beyond China and India, and Africa and South America and everywhere. I'm sure some of you remember the film Forbidden Planet from the 50s, where whatever these astronauts discovered, whatever their worst fear was, would basically come to life and eat them, or destroy and devour them. And in a kind of obverse of that, we're reached a point where our wishes can devour the planet. In other words, somebody develops a taste for sushi, like I have, and all of a sudden the oceans are stripped of bluefin tuna. And so we actually even have to think today, because we've become so consequential, that we have to be careful what we think of. Chinese medicines which use tiger bone, and all of a sudden the tiger's on the brink of extinction. So too the elephant and the rhino, or every major species. And our impact is also on the basic functions of the biosphere. It's become ubiquitous. E.O. Wilson, who I regard as one of the great scientists alive today, once put it that humanity is the first species to become a geophysical force. Someday, I hope it won't be, and I hope it will be because of our own foresight, which up till now has been lacking. Thank you. And we got plenty of time for questions. Yes, sir.
I'd like to take a helicopter
Wait,
view.
why don't we give him
Wait for a
life on our planet.
Howard, wait for a mic, okay?
Oh, what?
So everybody can hear you.
It's easier.
Thank you very much, by the way. It has raised my anxiety, but it also has raised my awareness. I'm a great lover of Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan opens up one of his books, I think it's called Dragons of Eden, and he says that in the history of the 3.5 billion years of the Earth, 90% of all life has gone extinct. 90%. From a helicopter view, we've gone through 5 or 6 major extinctions in 3.5 billion years. And obviously, according to Darwin, the great mechanism of adaptation and survival of the fittest has bacteria and viruses still alive.
What's your question?
It's not a question, I want to make a point.
We'll make it. Yeah, but this is
The point is that we're going to have adaptation and we're going to have extinction going on for millions of years. The tragedy probably is that we're probably the most aware species on the Earth, maybe in the Milky Way. So I think that's the tragedy. We're going to have this transition going on for many millions of years. So I want to say that adaptation will happen.
Well, yeah, it'll happen, but I mean, this is a case where it's a self-inflicted wound. If you can see the asteroid coming, maybe you can do something about it and not say it doesn't exist. That man in the back. Let's give him. Oh, I'm sorry. Go here first. Right, please.
You mentioned Paul Ehrlich in 1970 wrote The Population Bomb.
Yeah.
All of his predictions turned out to be disastrously false. There have been projections about population by official groups in the last 10 years, like the UN and lots of other people, that say a population will level off at a certain point and not become the catastrophic factor that you indicate. And there are demographic trends that show that. But you imply that population is going to be a tragedy, and there are loads of experts who disagree with you. Do you engage with those experts who disagree with you, and what do you argue with them? That population really is not a problem, and it's actually very sustainable in the current situation.
Paul Ehrlich was wrong. And he was wrong because he didn't take into account the Green Revolution. What happened is in one sense, the Earth has always been fully inhabited relative to the technologies available of the times. And so even, when it was a population of a couple of 100 million, that was probably the limit given to what we could grow and how. And we keep moving the goalposts. I'm pretty much involved right now in an agricultural biotech, and what we've seen is the Green Revolution ran its course pretty much, and then along came genetically modified organisms, which also moved the goalposts to some degree, and they've pretty much run their course. And there also is a good deal of resistance to those. The amount of arable land has basically been stable. And so, in fact, it's with climate change, it could actually be decreasing. So as the population grows by 80 million a year, we really have to get more out of either the same amount of land or, in some cases, less. And then secondly, water regimes are changing. But what we have seen is that even if I cited some statistics earlier that there's a great number of absolutely impoverished people, even if the level of the percentage of absolutely impoverished people has decreased.
Gone down from 60 to 10 in the last.
Yeah, but I mean, I mentioned those 20 countries which are fueling migration and destabilizing countries. We could hardly say that there are no population pressures if we have many governments actually on the point of being toppled because of the impacts of migration that are directly attributable to population rise. And those factors are going to get worse. Secondly, this gentleman mentioned the extinction crisis. Well, we're in the midst of an extinction crisis, and it's caused by the combination of human numbers and human appetites. And that is not reversing. Wildlands are disappearing everywhere. And they are not just, there for aesthetic reasons. They're genetic reservoirs, ecosystem functions, stabilize. 60% of ocean species need reefs in order to propagate. Wetlands and mangroves in the colder regions. These are all disappearing. So the sort of life support systems of the planet are being jeopardized at every turn. To turn around and say that just because we've gotten so far and that Paul Ehrlich was wrong, we should ignore population as an issue or as a factor, I think is grievously wrong.
They're not saying to ignore it. They're saying it's not a problem. They say that it's.
Well, that would be, if it's not a problem, you ignore it.
No, they're not ignoring it. They're taking it into account and figuring what the impact will be.
Well, we're already seeing the impacts. I mean, I think, they're called the Cornucopians, and the ones that basically see that, don't worry about population, just worry about, we'll always come up with a new technology to feed people. Well, it works until it doesn't.
Michael?
Yeah.
Wait for the mic.
So thank you for your talk. And I don't want you to take what I say as a criticism, but we read your message in the newspapers every day, in our magazines, on television. We're all believers. There's a very small percentage of people out there, including our president, who are climate change deniers, but most of us believe that we are undergoing climate change. So the real issue is, what are we going to do about it? And it seems to me that there are two avenues that we have been thinking about. One in the short term is what some of the scientists call sustainable urban planning. Build a wall around Miami so that, build a wall around Miami so that the rising seas in the near term won't flood the city and around New York. But in the longer term, how are we going to deal with the inevitable climate change? We don't have an international order of law that will govern every nation, as we see with the Paris Accord and our own president withdrawing from it. We know that if we took drastic actions and, for example, just said, over the next 5 years, we're going to ban all fossil fuels, we're going to improve our climate control problem, but we're all going to freeze in the dark. And we're going to have no manufacturing, we're going to have no cars, and so forth. So we have to take a pragmatic view and figure out how to do this over a period of time that is workable and sustainable. And that, to me, is the problem that the scientists haven't been able to come up with and convince the world about.
All right. Well, I think there's a lot in what you're asking. What I would say is that we had opportunities. We had opportunities over the years, and that's why I mentioned 1994, when and there was a pulse of interest in climate change, and then the fossil fuel lobby essentially took a playbook that they used a decade or so earlier to prevent action on dealing with stratospheric ozone depletion, and used it much more brilliantly with climate change. And that is to not say it doesn't exist, to just say, no, we don't really know whether or not it's real, so let's study it. And of course, that's a prescription for inaction. And there's a lot more to it than that in terms of why we didn't take action. I mentioned a couple of things about why there was a lack of urgency. The point is that at this point, had we done stuff back then, given tax credits for transition to renewables, all the things that we're talking about doing today, we'd be in worse shape. I will say to you right now that it is too late to stop some dramatic degree of climate change from affecting society. You could ban fossil fuels tomorrow. You can't ban fossil fuels tomorrow. Then nobody is going to do that. But you could start taking the actions that we should have taken in 1994, and we're still going to get to 2 degrees of warming. And we don't know what that's going to cost. But what we can do is at least get the incentives in line with where we need to be going. There is a rapid transition to electronic vehicles at the moment, electric vehicles at the moment. There's all sorts of transitions going on. I think the things that can happen, and one of the things that drives political conservatives crazy about climate change is they see it as a backdoor way to get to global government, which they hate. But you don't have to have global government. I think you have to have enlightened self-interest. And what I think is going to happen, absent any real movement from the Paris Accord, is that we are likely to see fossil fuel-related tariffs come in the not-too-distant future. In other words, tariffs aimed at those who are free-riding on others' actions to try and address the threat of greenhouse gases. Keep in mind that greenhouse gases are up there for 80 years or more. So there's an enormous amount of inertia in the system in emitting greenhouse gases. And there's a ever more limited capacity of the oceans, which have taken up much of the heat, to take up more heat. At some point, we're going to have all these positive feedbacks coming back as the warming of the permafrost releases billions of tons of methane, and carbon dioxide, as the oceans begin to give up some of the heat they've been absorbing for the past 100 years. And that's when things can get out of control. What we can do now is not stop it, but we can try to mute the edges. But it requires political awareness. I took place in a White House conference on climate change during Bill Clinton's years, and he was totally candid about this. He said, you know, I can't do anything on this if the American people don't care about the issue.
Hi, thanks a lot. My partner and I just finished this was our 12th week of a course on sustainability that we're doing here at IRP.
Oh, cool.
So everything that you just talked about, I think they've heard for the last 12 weeks.
Oops, sorry.
No, I'm really happy because whoever didn't take the course wasn't open to understanding the wider issues. And you covered it really beautifully. Today we covered was a report from 1965 that the American Petroleum Institute had released that never got widely known that talked about the carbon emissions. I don't know if you've seen that report, but
Yeah.
it's really great. So it shows how far back. And next week we're going to talk about Charles Mann and his new book, The Wizard and the Prophet, which deals with Norman Borlaug and the true founder of the environmental movement.
Thank you. Well, I'll let you.
Leslie down here.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Where am I going?
Sorry.
We'll get to
Where
you.
am I going?
Here.
Here. Oh.
Thank you. I think maybe in terms of population growth, we're a bit too alarmist because in developing countries, the size of a family and we don't even have a normal natural reproduction rate. We are below 2%. Now, some countries like China today is 1.4 billion people. Even then, it will go down to probably 800 million people. India will continue to grow. Africa will continue to grow. But as economic development continue to improve, to increase income, family income, and so on, it's a trend which is totally confirmed. The size of the family is going down, and it's going to be down to maybe two children per family, or even less in the years to come. And the other thing is this tremendous changes in technology. We have artificial intelligence, we have robotization. There are going to be billions of people who are not needed anymore. So we can still achieve the same kind of welfare with a considerably less population. We don't need the labor force of what we have. We don't need a Earth population of 7 or 8 billion people. Progressively, we can. So I think climate change is definitely a different issue, but also there are new cities being built, and they build those cities on a sustainable climate environment, whether it's in Asia, whether it's even in Africa, in Nigeria, and so on. They are very conscious about this. And so I think maybe we'll be too pessimistic.
Well, what I'll say to that is that if population is growing too fast for the growth to be absorbed economically, you end up with a lowered standard of living. And by the way, what you were saying is true, but it was said in 1994. And since 1994, global population has increased by over 2 billion people. And it's still growing by 80 million a year. And then we have a bunch of countries. I had some statistics in that op-ed at the Times of how many jobs would have to be created a month. We all know the non-farm payrolls figures that come out every month. And in the US, it averages 129,000 to accommodate population growth. In Honduras, if it was the size of the United States, they'd have to have 277,000, or 2.5 times our growth, just to accommodate population growth. In Tanzania, they'd have to have 600,000 jobs created a month just to accommodate and maintain economic stability. In other words, unless the numbers come down. Now, the other thing is the greatest lowering of the birth rates and population growth rates. It's been part of improvements in income, but the biggest thing has been urbanization, the movements of rural people to the cities, where in rural areas, having a big family is an economic plus. In an urban area, all of it becomes a liability. And you see, not even in over a generation, but in the course of a given generation, birth rates plummeting because housing is expensive in cities, you can't accommodate a big family, and if they have access to contraception, people make a choice to have a smaller family. That was not in anybody's family population planning regime, but it has had a bigger effect than anything else. I do think that, I'd like to be optimistic about that, and I agree that birth rates are coming down. But, we have this added factor right now of being on a knife edge in terms of being able to feed the world with a given climate, and that's changing. And that's why I talked about these two issues converging. Way in the back? Oh, wait,
Yes,
sorry.
the government just issued a consolidated
Yeah.
climate change report that, of course, Trump disavowed. How does that report compare with what you're saying? Do you agree with that report? Is it too
Well,
conservative?
they're constantly refining the statistics. It was definitely a well-intentioned scientific report with trying to integrate the best available information on all these issues. As it came up with a estimate of economic damage of future climate change vastly beyond any prior estimates. So it was useful in that regard.
That was
but,
the effect on the GDP in the future?
Yeah, its impact on GDP, right? But the telling factor is that figure I gave at the beginning of the talk, that more than half the people in the country don't believe that climate change will affect them in their lifetime. With that kind of complacency, we're not going to deal with the issue. And the point at which the point at which complacency turns to alarm, as it's doing. Let me give you one example here. These hurricanes are causing enormous economic damage. At some point, the insurance companies are going to react and raise rates. And all of a sudden, people in coastal areas or living on the seashore in Florida or up the coast of the Atlantic and the Gulf Coast, one of two choices. One, rates are going to rise, and all of a sudden they won't be able to sell their homes if they're too low-lying, or the insurance rates will be unaffordable. Or two, we'll socialize the costs. What Florida has done, and the reason people are still buying madly along the coast, is they've socialized the costs. All the insurers pulled out, and then the state picked up the backstop for all the insurers, and they're one big hurricane away from that state facility being bankrupt, in which case all the people who lived in the high ground in the middle of the state are going to be subsidizing the rich people on the coast, and I don't think that's politically going to be sustainable. So I think the market itself is actually going to start shifting opinions on climate change fairly quickly. Yes?
So I have a question about political will. And I've heard that some scientists have said that the worst thing that ever happened for the environmental movement was Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, because it immediately politicized the issue so that conservatives would automatically deny climate change simply because it was Al Gore. And would you comment on how to unpoliticize this?
Well, it was politicized in '98 before Inconvenient Truth, and it was really interesting how there was a large degree of rising concern about climate change in the '90s, and then remember the impeachment hearings on Clinton and everything else, and all of a sudden that issue became politicized. The fossil fuel lobby had been pushing to politicize it before that, but it really gained traction. Anthony Leseritz at Yale has done a lot of polling on this. But I do agree that if you can assign it, like if Nancy Pelosi had pushed climate change, of course the right would then say, this is her issue and it's going to kill you all. But look at what happened with Obamacare. It was a Massachusetts conservative program, I think, promoted by the Heritage Society, and then Obama adopted it and then Romney actually ran away from his own program, and all of a sudden Obamacare was demonized. Now everybody loves it. So these issues I agree with you, they get politicized in it, but I don't think Al Gore was the problem. I mean, he was part of, putting his name on it didn't help, but the process started long before that. There's a couple behind you.
I don't know. How about the fellow
Thank you for your speech. I see as the future, and I want you to comment on this, that there's going to be a moral issue between the have countries and the have not countries. Why are the have countries going to continue to allow and to sustain these countries, North Africa, parts of the Middle East, and Central America, whose populations are not under control, and we can't sustain them? So there's a moral issue as to what we should do about it. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the issues, the ironies of the caravan, going back to that, is that it is in our interest to sort of help create stable governments in Honduras and Guatemala, and try and deal with it. They're the two fastest growing countries in the Americas in population terms, and try and deal with their demographic problems through contraception programs and others, in order that you don't have people trying to migrate to the United States. The argument for dealing with economic conditions in Africa is that if you improve conditions in the home countries, there's less of a migration problem, and you don't have them flooding into your borders in Europe, for instance. So I think it is in our self-interest, and it's always been in our self-interest, to sort of pursue economic development in poorer countries in order just to deal with that very issue of future migration. Yes.
What change, if any, do you believe will avert the coming crisis?
None. The crisis is coming. The question is whether we can round the edges. And I think I tried to address that earlier. There's putting 6 or so billion excess tons of carbon in the atmosphere every year is anything we do to lessen that burden is going to help. But the point is that we had chances to do something about this in the late 80s and in the 90s, and we failed. Now it's upon us, and these are long wavelength phenomena. They are not readily addressable. We could, no matter what we did tomorrow, we are going to be facing a changing climate. Taking carbon out of the atmosphere is something that's been proposed. No one has proposed an economically viable way of doing that at this point. But to me, it's kind of bizarre. It's sort of like I'm holding a gun to my head. I can either put the gun down or put on a helmet. And we talk about putting on a helmet. And, putting the gun down and putting on a helmet may be a good idea. I murdered that metaphor, by the way. Go ahead. Yes.
I have a question because I'm very concerned about not only the fires, but the tsunamis, the tornadoes, the hurricanes. Besides the fossil fuels and taking care of the carbons, are there any concrete things that governments around the world can do? Like, could we have desalination plants in California, and so that the lands themselves become more arid so they don't burn? Or what other concrete steps can be taken to cool the waters down, the oceans? Is there anything in the works right now, scientifically?
There's nothing you can do about the oceans. I mean, they're too big. Desal for changing weather patterns, for arid regions. Desalination is very expensive. Saudi Arabia can afford it, but you can't really do it at scale, at least not yet. So there are not many things we can do. The things we can do are changing individual choices about what we buy. Where 70% of GDP is consumer spending. If we actually all started making purchases with these kind of impacts in mind, it would have a radical change on everything up the chain, up the production and industrial chain. So that's the change, but that requires a change in that requires public concern much broader than we have right now. And having beaten my head against the wall since the 80s on climate change, I can tell you it is not a matter of just getting out information. It is a matter of people actually perceiving economic impacts, which are beginning to happen, and perceiving that this is going to affect their lives now, which is beginning to happen.
I'm interested in the timeline.
Yeah.
You've talked about how all of this will affect the people in this room. We've seen the problem on the coast. I'm a victim of that. For the people in this room, when, best guess, assuming nothing really changes, can we see damage to us?
Well, if depending on where you live,
Let's say
right
5
now
years,
going on.
5 years, 10 years,
Yeah.
20 years.
Well,
What can happen?
Well, what we're seeing, one of the points I made was that, the rise of like Orban and Hungary and all these other the Austrian leader, and the rise of all these ultra-right parties in Europe is connected to climate change. So in that sense, it's a second derivative, but you're seeing an impact right now. As these impacts, as climate continues to warm, the impacts will go beyond the coast. As we saw, now it's the hurricanes, right? Then you get flooding, like the incredible floods in Maryland, which were not hurricane related, but related just to one of the oldest predicted impacts of climate change was that it would lead to more extreme storms.
How about New York?
In New York, we already saw it with Hurricane Sandy.
Okay, but that's the beginning.
That's the beginning, but keep in mind the damage that was done. I mean, I said $5 billion for the subways. It was a hell of a lot more than that.
Well,
for the
there's
rest
been
of
a study that says New York City in 30 or 40 years, Lower Manhattan could be underwater.
Well, parts of it. But people will adjust. One thing you don't do is you don't rebuild in harm's way, and I think the market will start changing where we actually live in regard to exposures to these things. You cannot eliminate all dry tinder and brush. For instance, in California, when the Santa Ana winds come, but maybe we should think twice about building in these fire zones as fires become more frequent. So what you're going to see is, as these things, as climate change translates into real economic impacts, people will react, and we will see those changes. And we're already seeing them right now. It'll just be more and more and more as these derivative impacts, some of which we haven't anticipated, become more evident. Yes?
Besides improving the economic conditions of Africa and the countries where there's great migration, what about birth control?
Well, that's what I was talking about. Give access to contraception. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
to me, that's the simplest thing in the
Yeah,
world.
because you see a person, a couple with a child that's 1 year old and she's pregnant and they're migrating. It just is unbelievable how anyone can survive that kind of condition with a tiny child and being pregnant.
I'm glad you put it that way, because, I mean, too many people lose sight of the fact that these women are not migrating in order to take advantage of economic. You don't walk 1,000 miles with an infant if just because you think there's a better job. You walk because you cannot stay home. It's less safe to take a desperate journey than it is to stay at home, and that's, I think, an important thing to recognize.
I usually don't need a mic, but I was wondering, considering that we can't even get the subways together in New York, are there any model countries that have actually provided infrastructure, like other than maybe Holland? Or where is the infrastructure investment going to come from with the political situation that you've described?
Well, it hasn't happened yet. I mean, Holland, and of course there is the seawall in the Thames to prevent flooding, the multi-billion-dollar project in England. No, there hasn't been much adaptation. Indonesia is talking, because Jakarta is sinking, both because they're pulling up water from the groundwater and the land is sinking, and then there's sea level rise, so half of it's underwater part of the day. They're thinking about a multi-tens of billion-dollar seawall project. I don't know that Indonesia can afford it.
But nothing's happened. Well, because we just finished a course on mystery novels, when one of them's about Venice, but Venice also, they proposed an offshore.
Yeah.
Yeah, but nothing's happened, right?
Well, look at the shape that Italy's in right now. I mean, how do you fund it?
They are allowing me to speak too. I wanted to talk about the migration problem. Definitely Honduras, Guatemala, gangs, people can't be safe in their homes, and that's what's motivating a lot of change. But think about the Middle East, these wars, terrible wars. You can't live in Syria. In some cases, you can't live in Iraq, and that is what is generating in Africa too, I suppose. That is what is generating a huge amount of immigration, and that's not really related to climate change.
To some degree, it is. I mean, if you have what I mentioned earlier, where you have people dispossessed from the land, moving and creating migration pressures both into the cities in these countries and also across borders. And you also have, as I mentioned, Thomas Homan Dixon's thesis on idled young men, being attracted to extremist groups. These are second derivatives, but they're all related. The fact of the matter is you have a combination of population pressures, water scarcity, and climate instability and heat in all these countries, and they all cause people to be on the move, and they destabilize regions.
Might it not be helpful to talk about population displacement rather than migration? Because I think it does two things. It more properly helps us to understand the position of the people moving, and it lessens the us and them equation. We are all in this together on the same planet, and when people are moving in the way that they are not migrating, they are being displaced.
It's a good point. Good luck with that, though. I think, we have a hard enough time. Look at that. I just wrote a note to NPR because I got sick of hearing them talking about a caravan marching towards the United States, which implies military discipline. And you've got a mother, and I suggested they use the word toddling in the case of infants, shambling in the case of people carrying a lot of their possessions, but they weren't marching. And yet this is NPR, the BBC, the New York Times, all these news medias that ought to know better, not realizing that the word marching is freighted with a kind of invasive notion. So if we can't even get the most enlightened media in the United States or in the world to not realize that these people aren't marching, you're going to have a hard time substituting the word displacement for migration, even though your point is well taken.
There's an issue with that hasn't really been reported so much with the ice melting. As far as the poles are concerned, there's so much ice that has been has broken off and gone into the oceans that, to the extent that it's actually changed the salinity of the oceans and has impacted the
thermohaline circulation,
the fishing supplies, and of course that's that's also a food and food security issue. To what extent will that impact, let's say, food security with respect to climate change?
Well, the fish stocks are already overfished and they're already in trouble. So, and some of these are pretty delicate. You've got seabird populations collapsing because of fish populations changing. So there are signals that the changes in the ocean are already having an impact. The biggest change from salinity, I think, would be in the North Atlantic, and the danger of a shutdown of the thermohaline circulation, which delivers heat to Europe, which has happened before. And that is one of the triggers for rapid climate change and what are called Dansgaard-Oskar events, where you basically shut down the thing and you have very dramatic changes in the north in the matter of a few years. So salinity is a huge deal. By the way, when I was writing Winds of Change, the conventional wisdom among the scientists was there wasn't enough ice up there to melt and change the salinity in the North Atlantic. And now, of course, oops, maybe there is. Yes.
Mike is coming.
And how many?
Make this the last.
This will be the last question. And I invite all of you to come up and look at this beautiful array of books.
Me, one of the biggest disasters which made us lose ground was the Electoral College, because the Republican presidents who lost the election in 2016, actual vote, first thing they did was institute the global gag rule, because
Put it closer.
most women want birth control, but they don't have access to it and they can't afford it. So since the Republican regimes institute the global gag rule and cut down on family planning money, are there other rich countries around the world that are helping these
Sure.
poor countries?
Yeah, there are. I mean, and I also think that a lot of this contraception availability will probably be restored, and hopefully down the road. But yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, you know, politics very much impacts all of these issues, and has for decades. It's one of the reasons not much has happened. It's always been tough to get family planning money, any sort of budget for it, and access. The other thing, by the way, on demographic and population, another factor that reduces birth rates is education. As the state of Kerala in India has shown, more educated women have fewer children. Anyway, thank you all, and
Thank you, Eugene. And come down. Anybody would like his books? They're here for sale, and I'm sure he'd be glad to autograph them if you buy one.